Well, I'm thinking just as we're speaking now, there is a difference in between the kind of spiritual camaraderie that I experienced with men
Right.
and the somewhat more erotic intimacy that I experience with women. And
Right.
and there, I'm kind of very careful in using those words
Right.
because I think there is a line separating between spiritual intimacy and
Right.
sexual intimacy.
Right.
But I think there is an erotic element in both of them
Yeah.
that I feel more strongly, or that I feel like there is an easier mutual surrender when
Right.
that happens in relationship with women.
Right. I think that's probably the case. One of the differences, it's usually listed in the archetypal differences between masculine and feminine, is males, masculine drive is generally more erotic. It's visually oriented and it has an enormous drive towards sexual components, erotic sexual release and components.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that women can't have an enormous sex drive or all of that. It's just generally speaking, it's not as quite as pressing as it is for a man. And so whenever you're discussing male psychology, there's often a bit of an erotic component that gets in there. And oftentimes, if it's just a component of their sexual drive, it can actually make whatever field they're transferring it into function better.
Yes.
Because it's still an aggressive energy, but it's no longer explicitly sexual. It just pushes like hell.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a very important part of male psychology when you look at it. And I think it's particularly, I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it's particularly the case in spiritual situations. And so you were hesitant to mention an erotic attachment you could have because that's so often misunderstood. But I immediately understood what you meant. And I'm trying to give one sort of explanation of that. But I think it continues to drive men very sharply in almost any field that they might transfer it to. And I think that's especially true in areas that we would call Platonic, for example, because that Platonic, all it really means is not explicitly sexual.
Yes.
But there's can be a lot of transferred erotic drive occurring.
Yeah, yeah. And I find that there is a very delicate line there, which enables, and I'm kind of I'm experimenting with that, enables kind of using that erotic component for deepening the spiritual intimacy and openness and the vulnerability and the actualization of deeper potentials, without sliding into the romantic sexual kind of seductive field. And it's a very tricky business.
And I think being able to distinguish those two areas is part of what constitutes what typically would be called maturity for a man. And I think that in a lot of typical conventional men, that hasn't occurred very much. And so what we often see is that I'll call it Platonic drive isn't well distinguished when they're married. And so they end up having a lot of affairs because they're still thinking, oh, I actually want to have real sex with this person.
Yes.
And they often do, and it's only like a one-time only, or some other disaster ends up happening. But that's a fairly common archetypal story throughout human history. Well,
it's confusing. To hold that line is really playing with fire, you could say.
And there are no, because it's not well understood, there aren't any widely adopted role models for how to do that. So even somebody like yourself, who's very mature, as we're using the term, very grown up and fairly enlightened, when you're interacting with a spiritual teacher who's already acknowledged as being a teacher, somebody you're to look up to, there's no official role for you to fall into when you bring a platonic erotic interest into that. And so it's something that you have to be careful when you even talk about that. So if, like, your spiritual teacher found out that you had felt an erotic drive, you'd have to have a discussion. We're on our own when we have to figure these things out.
Yeah, I've noticed.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about it. I'm happy we can have this conversation.
Sure.
This, again, this is it's very tricky what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
It's very, I feel that even erotic sexual attraction, in my case to a woman, can serve for spiritual growth and intimacy. Without, in my experience, the condition is not to cross the line to the sexual romantic area,
right?
Which is confusing because it feels so much the same.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if you ask me, how do I know that I'm not crossing the line?
Yeah.
It's pure intuition. I don't know. I don't know. And I also, to be honest, I don't know if I'm not deluding myself, if I'm not just playing with that feeling and enjoying that feeling and calling it, kind of giving it some spiritual.
Right. Well, I would, I guess, warn you, if that's not too strong a term, against not trusting that intuition that you have, that you're not going over a line. Because again, this is just not an area that this society discusses very much. So the number of discussions you've had about this topic are probably, you can count them on one hand if you've had.
Yes.
But because you are, I really don't like the word mature, but we've started using that for somebody that's greatly grown up. Because you are a mature person, I think that you all of the tools necessary to correctly intuit when you're stepping over the line versus when you're not. I think those are all largely in place. And when you would start to use them for the first time, you wouldn't have a whole lot of experiences of when you used it in the past. Because again, men just aren't supposed to talk about this stuff.
Yes.
But everything that I know about you so far would suggest to me that you do have those tools available, that the first time you use them could feel a little weird, because it always does.
Yes.
And so if you were reporting this, like for the first time or second time or even the earliest time, you would have to, because you're honest, say, I'm just intuiting this and I don't even know if I'm crossing over the line or not, but somehow it doesn't seem like I am. And that's why you have allowed this erotic drive to continue. You haven't fought it, let's say. You haven't said, oh, I can't be thinking those things or anything like that. Right. It's just back there, you're aware of it, But you know what it is, and you know when the line, whatever that line of crossing over is, if you crossed over it, you would know it.
Yes.
It's particularly if you did it in behavior.
Yes. Yes. So that to me, that line is very clear and unmistakable.
Yeah.
But I think, you see,
Are you having questions about whether you should even be having some thoughts like that? Is that the problem?
No, I should.
Okay.
I mean, some of my deepest experiences of oneness with another person happened with women, and they are accompanied with a sense of love.
Right.
And it is somewhat confusing because it's so much similar to romantic love.
Yeah.
So to me, I definitely wouldn't want to not have such experiences because of the concern, but I'm acknowledging that it is confusing.
Right. Well, one partial explanation for that is that the erotic experiences that you have had, the real erotic, real sexual experiences, are, if we look at this whole area of drive that men have, that's a very real drive, a very real experience. But it's also, if you look at the higher Platonic versions of that drive, then it makes the original sexual drive itself a subset of a larger set of drives that mature men can have. And so that's, again, because we don't have any experience of this, we don't have any role models for this, it can be confusing learning where to draw the line. You sort of know there's sort of a difference, but exactly where to draw it can be tough.